We'd been considering showcasing the history of the seizure of the Japanese-Canadian fishing fleet for a little while, and it was during the original research process that we discovered there were a lot of similarities between the sentiments against Japanese immigrants and Japanese Canadians living in BC from around 100 years ago. There were a lot of similarities with the current sentiments against immigration nowadays, Syrian refugees, and prejudicial sentiments against other cultural groups. And we thought it was an important fact to connect the similarities between these two groups and to use the history to highlight what's going on now. So our exhibit starts with an introduction to the early immigrants that came from Japan to BC and who they were. Primarily they were young, able-bodied, unwed males, and they came from small fishing villages in the south of Japan, came here to work as fishermen. And one of the earliest documented immigrants was Manzo Nagano, who came to New Westminster in 1877. The section we're looking at now is an explanation of some of the community aspects of the Japanese-Canadian fishermen. The population of Japanese nationals and Japanese Canadians in Canada was 95% located in BC before the Second World War. And there were a number of significant communities, particularly in Steveston, and the group strength of the Japanese-Canadian fishermen community was that they were able to create the Japanese Fishermen's Association in the Fraser River, and this really benefited the whole community by using association fees to construct and support a Japanese Fishermen's Hospital, which was used by all of the community of Steveston, and also to support a Japanese language school. In this section, the exhibit looks at Japanese Canadians in different aspects of the fishing industry. They were extremely successful fishermen, and they developed new techniques of fishing and new areas of fishing, one of them being the salt salmon and salt herring fishery, which had been previously unexploited by the local populations. And this became almost entirely Japanese-Canadian run industry, and the exports also were primarily Asian. They would export salt herring and salt salmon overseas to Japan and to China. But Japanese Canadians were also heavily involved in the boat building industry, and many fishermen in the off-season worked as shipwrights and boat builders. The canneries had boat building sites that were operated by Japanese Canadians, and a lot of these boat builders introduced new techniques into boat building, which helped to strengthen fishing boat hulls, and a lot of them used traditional Japanese tools alongside Western-style boat building tools. So the models that we have on display in the exhibition are from the collection in the Vancouver Maritime Museum, and they're models of Japanese-Canadian built fishing boats from the 1920s and 1930s. And these particular examples are boats that were seized during the Second World War and then sold off by the Japanese Fishing Vessel Disposal Committee. The restrictions that we were talking about before were extremely harsh and did a significant amount of damage to the Japanese-Canadian fishing community, but the most damaging was the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Imperial Army bombed Pearl Harbor, and only hours after that, the report went out for all Japanese fishermen to return to port, and the following day the Canadian Navy began impounding and seizing their vessels to search for any evidence of communication with the Japanese Navy. In total, there were 1,137 boats that were confiscated and were registered in New Westminster by the Japanese Fishing Vessel Disposal Committee, which was a committee that was created in order to return these seized boats to active duty into the hands of non-Japanese fishermen and canneries, to the Canadian Navy and the British Admiralty. So after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of discussion about the trustworthiness of the Japanese population in BC, and a lot of politicians were arguing for their removal from the coast. And on March 4th, 1942, the BC Security Commission was created in order to facilitate a plan to remove the Japanese population from the coast of BC to the interior. There were high-up people who didn't believe that this was a necessary action. The commissioner of the RCMP argued that there was no evidence of any sabotage or any desire to invade or join the Japanese forces. But as history tells us, over 21,000 Japanese nationals and Japanese Canadian citizens were evacuated and put into internment camps in the interior of BC, in Alberta, and in prisoner of war camps in Ontario. The exhibit, The Lost Fleet, centers around the seizure of nearly 1,200 Japanese Canadian owned and operated fishing vessels. But we wanted to go beyond that and look at the early history of Japanese Canadian fishermen and the restrictions and prejudice and racism that they faced in the early half of the 20th century. And then throughout the war period, we look at the overall Japanese Canadian experience in the internment camps, and finally we look at the movement towards redress and acknowledgement of the injustices that were caused. And in doing so, we bring it into a more modern context with the current injustices and prejudice that you can see in various parts of the world towards other cultural groups, and in Canada towards certain immigrant groups like the Syrian refugees, to really show the value of understanding the history of the Japanese Canadian experience and how that is still a relevant topic today. So we're here at the Vancouver Maritime Museum in Vanier Park, and we're here to explore the brand new exhibit, The Lost Fleet. And this is an exhibit that goes on until March 25th of 2018.